Stalin's Shadow, the Gulag and the Ghosts of Barbarossa. The winter of 1937 descended upon Moscow like a shroud, and with it came a terror that moved through the streets not with boots and bayonets alone, but with whispers, with the sudden absence of neighbors, with the black cars that appeared in the night and left only silence in their wake. Joseph Stalin sat in the Kremlin, a man who had climbed over mountains of bodies to reach the summit of absolute power, and now he gazed out upon his empire with eyes that saw enemies in every shadow, traitors behind every door. The revolution had devoured its own children, as revolutions always do. But this devouring had become systematic, industrial, a machine that ground human lives into dust with bureaucratic efficiency. In those years before the Great War would sweep across the Rodina like a scythe through wheat, Stalin made decisions that would shape not only his own fate but the fate of millions. He looked upon his officer corps, the men who had led the Red Army to victory in the Civil War, who had forged a military force from the chaos of revolution, and he saw conspirators. He saw men who might challenge him, who possessed the loyalty of soldiers, who held the keys to power that came from the barrel of a gun. And so he signed the orders, thousands upon thousands of orders, each one a death sentence wrapped in the language of state security and revolutionary justice. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky stood before his accusers in June of 1937, a man who had revolutionized Soviet military doctrine, who had written treatises on modern warfare and mechanized tactics that would prove prophetic in the crucible of combat to come. But prophecy meant nothing in the basement rooms of the Lubyanka, where truth was whatever the interrogators decided it should be. They accused him of espionage, of plotting with Germany, of conspiracies so elaborate and fantastic that they collapsed under the weight of their own absurdity. Yet absurdity had become the new reality in Stalin's Soviet Union, where the impossible was routine and the innocent were guilty by decree. The bullet that ended Tukhachevsky's life echoed through the corridors of the Red Army like a thunderclap. It was followed by thousands more. 3 of 5 marshals executed. 13 of 15 army commanders dead. 8 of 9 admirals gone. Half of the entire officer corps, perhaps more, vanished into the night. Some died quickly, a bullet to the back of the head in a soundproofed room. Others were sent east, far to the east, where the forest stretched beyond the horizon and winter lasted 8 months of the year. The Gulag Archipelago, as it would one day be called, was not born in the purges of the late 1930s, but it metastasized then, grew into a vast network of suffering that stretched from the White Sea to the Pacific, from the Arctic Circle to the steppes of Kazakhstan. It was an empire within an empire, a parallel civilization built on forced labor and broken spirits. The camps had existed since the early days of Bolshevik rule, places to send enemies of the revolution, but under Stalin they transformed into something else entirely, something that served multiple purposes in the machinery of the totalitarian state. Imagine boarding a train in Moscow, a prisoner in a cattle car packed so tightly that standing was the only possibility, that breathing itself became an act of will. The journey might last weeks, crossing the Urals into Siberia, moving deeper and deeper into landscapes where civilization was a memory and nature reigned in its most unforgiving form. The prisoners were everyone and no one, party members who had spoken carelessly, peasants who had resisted collectivization, intellectuals whose thoughts had wandered into forbidden territory, soldiers whose competence had made them suspect, ordinary citizens whose only crime was existing in the wrong place at the wrong moment when the quota for arrests needed to be filled. In the camps of Kolyma, far in the northeast where temperatures could fall to 50 degrees below zero, men worked in the gold mines that fed the state treasury. They wore whatever rags they had brought with them, supplemented by whatever they could steal or barter, and they worked shifts that lasted 12 hours in darkness that swallowed hope itself. The guards watched from towers, but often the cold was guard enough. Where would a man run in such a wilderness? The tiger stretched in all directions, empty of mercy, and the bears and wolves were less dangerous than the cold that could kill an exposed man in minutes. The rations were calculated with precision, enough to keep a man working but never enough to restore what the labor took from him. 300 grams of bread, perhaps some thin soup with bits of fish head floating in murky water, tea that was little more than hot-colored liquid. A man's body became a thing he no longer recognized, all sharp angles and protruding bones, skin stretched tight over a frame that seemed to collapse inward. The strong might last a year, perhaps two. The weak died within months. And yet the system demanded more work as always, and so the trains kept coming, bringing fresh bodies to replace those who had fallen. But the Gulag was not only punishment, not only repression. It was economic policy. The vast projects of industrialization that Stalin commanded required labor on a scale that normal wages could never supply. And so the prisoners built canals and railways, logged forests and mined ore, drained swamps and constructed dams. They died building these monuments to socialist progress, died in numbers that made casualty lists meaningless, died and were buried in unmarked graves or simply left where they fell to be covered by snow and forgotten. Among those who vanished into this system were the military men, the officers and strategists and commanders who might have saved countless lives in the war to come. They had studied in the military academies, had learned the lessons of the World War and the Civil War, had begun to understand the nature of modern mechanized warfare. They had read Clausewitz and contemplated the changing character of combat in an age of tanks and aircraft. And then they were gone, erased, their expertise lost, their experience wasted in camps where their greatest challenge was surviving another day. The purge created a void that could not be filled quickly or easily. Junior officers were promoted far beyond their competence, finding themselves commanding divisions when they barely understood how to lead a company. Political loyalty became more valuable than military skill, and the commissars, the political officers who watched and reported and judged, held power that undermined the chain of command and bred paralysis in decision-making. The Red Army, which had been developing sophisticated doctrines of combined arms warfare and deep operations, reverted to simpler, more rigid thinking as the men who understood complexity were dead or broken. Stalin believed he was making himself safer, eliminating potential threats before they could materialize. He believed in the confessions, or perhaps he simply found them useful regardless of their truth. He believed that terror would make the state stronger, that fear would forge loyalty more durable than love or respect. But terror is a weapon that cuts in all directions, and the wounds it inflicts upon the wielder are often invisible until the moment they prove fatal. The German intelligence services watched the purges with satisfaction that bordered on disbelief. They had feared the Soviet military potential, had worried about the vast manpower and industrial capacity that lay to the east. Now they saw that potential crippled from within, saw officers of genuine ability replaced by men chosen for political reliability rather than military competence. When the Wehrmacht began planning for Operation Barbarossa, for the great invasion that would come in the summer of 1941, they factored in the damage Stalin had done to his own military. They assumed the Red Army would collapse quickly, that the decapitated command structure would prove unable to coordinate resistance, that the fear and suspicion bred by the purges would paralyze initiative at every level. In the camps, men who might have been generals labored in mines. They broke rocks and hauled timber and tried not to remember what they had once been. Some held on to hope that they might one day be rehabilitated, might be called back into service, might prove their loyalty through suffering. Others simply endured, day by day, finding meaning in survival itself or in the small kindnesses that occasionally flickered between prisoners, brief moments of humanity in a system designed to strip humanity away. The guards themselves were often barely different from the prisoners, men and women assigned to this duty who knew that a wrong word, a mistake, a moment of perceived weakness could put them on the other side of the wire. The system consumed everyone it touched, turned human beings into instruments of suffering or objects of it, and the distinction between the two could vanish in an instant. Stalin's mistake was not simply that he killed capable officers or sent them to camps. His mistake was deeper, more fundamental. He destroyed trust, the invisible bond that allows organizations to function under stress. He created a military in which initiative was dangerous, in which independent thinking invited suspicion, in which every officer knew that success might be as dangerous as failure if it made them too visible, too valuable, too threatening to someone higher in the hierarchy. He created a culture in which covering one's own position mattered more than taking risks for victory, in which political orthodoxy trumped tactical flexibility. When the German panzers crashed across the Soviet border on June 22, 1941, in the pre-dawn darkness of that summer morning, they found exactly what they expected to find. They found a Red Army that was vast in numbers but poorly led, that had weapons and men but lacked the coordination to use them effectively, that responded to the invasion with confusion and paralysis because no one dared make decisions without permission from above, and permission from above came slowly or not at all. The frontier armies were encircled and destroyed within days. Entire divisions surrendered or simply dissolved. The maps in German headquarters showed advances that exceeded even the optimistic projections, showed a military disaster unfolding at a pace that suggested the Soviet state itself might collapse within weeks. In those first terrible months, as the Germans drove deeper and deeper into Soviet territory, as millions of Red Army soldiers marched into captivity and millions more died in desperate last stands or futile counterattacks, some of the prisoners in the camps heard rumors of war. They heard that the Rodina was in danger, that the fascists were coming, and they wondered if perhaps now, in this moment of supreme crisis, they might be remembered. And some were. In ones and twos, then in larger numbers, officers were pulled from the camps, given uniforms again, sent to the front with their records marked rehabilitated, though no one admitted that they should never have been imprisoned in the first place. Konstantin Rokossovsky emerged from the camps with broken ribs and missing teeth, his body marked by torture but his mind still sharp, and he would go on to become one of the great commanders of the war. Others returned as well, men who had survived long enough to be needed again, who could be given back their ranks because the catastrophe at the front meant that competence had suddenly become more valuable than political reliability. But for everyone who returned, dozens had already died in the camps, their potential lost forever, their knowledge and skill buried in the frozen earth of Kolyma or the forests of the Urals. The Gulag itself did not end with the war, did not dissolve in the face of the greater threat. It continued to function, continued to consume lives, became if anything more important as the industrial demands of total war required ever more labor. New categories of prisoners arrived, people from the occupied territories suspected of collaboration, ethnic minorities accused of disloyalty, Soviet soldiers who had been prisoners of the Germans and were punished for the crime of surviving capture. The logic of the system was self-perpetuating, requiring constant feeding, and the war provided new justifications for the terror that had never really needed justification. Stalin's biggest mistake before Barbarossa was not a single decision but a pattern of decisions, a worldview that saw enemies where there were servants, that confused fear with loyalty, that believed absolute power required absolute suspicion. He weakened his state in the name of strengthening it. He created vulnerabilities while believing he was eliminating them. He sent men to die slowly in camps when they might have saved others from dying quickly in battle. The cost of this mistake cannot be calculated in numbers alone, though the numbers are staggering enough. Perhaps 30 million Soviet citizens died in the war, military and civilian together, a toll so vast it defies comprehension. How many of those deaths might have been prevented with better military leadership, with officers who had not been purged or broken, with a command structure that functioned on competence rather than terror? The question is unanswerable, but the reality is clear. The Soviet Union won the war, yes, but won it through suffering on a scale that might have been reduced, through sacrifices that were made necessary partly by the wounds Stalin had inflicted upon his own military in the years before the war began. In the end, the Gulag stood as testament to a particular kind of totalitarian logic, one in which the state justified any action by claiming necessity, in which individual lives had no meaning except as components in the greater machinery of power. It was a system that reflected Stalin's paranoia and ambition in equal measure, that served both his psychology and his politics. And when the test came, when the invasion arrived and the Red Army faced the most professional military force then existing in the world, the price of that system became written in blood across 1,000 miles of front, in cities besieged and villages destroyed, in lives ended and futures erased. The camps had served the state, but they had also weakened it profoundly, had robbed it of some of its best defenders just when it needed them most. This was Stalin's mistake, and the Soviet people paid for it in ways that echo still through the decades, in memories of suffering that cannot be forgotten because they were suffered not only at the hands of enemies but at the hands of their own state, their own leader, the man who claimed to speak for them while he ground their lives beneath his heel.